"Welcome to our channel. You need a home and I need a father," said the young man to the cowboy on the park bench, the words spoken with a mix of desperation and defiance hung in the frigid Christmas Eve air. Wyatt spun his head around, startled. He'd been staring so hard at the frosted grass he hadn't noticed the approach. A young man, maybe 21, stood before him, hands shoved deep into the pockets of a thin jacket. His face was sharp with cold, his eyes a clear, piercing green. Wyatt didn't move. He sat hunched on the bench, shadow under the dim park light, his dark brown cowboy hat pulled low to shield him from the biting wind. He was wrapped in a worn shearling coat that had seen better decades, clutching a small battered leather satchel on his lap like a lifeline. Snowflakes clung to the weathered lines around his pale blue eyes. "You can live with me," the young man said with the pure conviction of someone with nothing left to lose. Wyatt finally looked up, his gaze practiced and cautious. "Son, what are you talking about?" His voice was a low rumble, hoarse from the cold and disuse. The young man, Edward, took a small step closer. "Look, I get it. I probably sound crazy, but my apartment is warm. I've got a couch. It's Christmas Eve and no one should be out here freezing and, well, my family kicked me out a few years ago for being gay. I've been on my own ever since. I know what it's like to need a safe place." He gestured vaguely back toward the city lights. "I make a decent living as a graphic designer. It's not much, but it's a home." Wyatt narrowed his eyes. The kid's skin was flushed from the cold, but his gaze was steady. A quiet shiver ran through Wyatt's own limbs as he clutched the satchel tighter. He hadn't begged, he hadn't spoken a word to anyone all day. Yet this kid's directness felt louder than any shouted plea. "I don't need charity," Wyatt muttered, his voice rough with pride. "It's not charity," Edward insisted. "It's an exchange. You get a roof over your head, and I get to not feel so damn alone on Christmas." Wyatt tried to push himself up to wave the kid off and disappear back into the anonymity of the city, but a wave of dizziness washed over him. His knees felt weak, his body protesting the days of cold and lack of food. He stumbled, his hand flying out to grip the icy metal armrest of the bench to keep from falling. Edward rushed forward instinctively. "Hey, are you okay?" Wyatt didn't answer, just shook his head, his breathing shallow. The world tilted slightly, the distant Christmas carols blurring into a dull hum. This young man was offering a hand, and Wyatt was too weak and too tired to push it away any longer. He didn't know his name, didn't know his story, but something had shifted inside him the moment the kid had spoken. He should have walked away, but he couldn't. "Let's go," Edward said, his voice low and urgent. He gently took Wyatt's arm, helping him to his feet. The cowboy was surprisingly unsteady, leaning on him more than either of them expected. They moved slowly, the snow crunching under their feet. Edward's apartment wasn't far, a small walk up a few blocks away, but every step felt heavy with the unspoken weight of their shared loneliness. As they reached the door, Edward unlocked it and pushed it open, revealing a small, sparsely decorated but warm space. "Welcome home," he whispered, though he wasn't sure who he was saying it to. The fire escape rattled softly in the wind. Wyatt stirred beneath the warm weight of a thick quilt, his eyelashes fluttering. The air smelled of cinnamon-scented candles and brewing coffee. As he opened his eyes, the room came into focus. Small living area with a worn sofa, a tall bookshelf filled with art books, and a tiny kitchenette where Edward was. Pouring hot water into 2 mugs, he was. On the couch, a pillow under his head. His coat and hat were placed neatly on a nearby chair he didn't remember much of. The walk, just the steadying presence of the young man beside him. Edward noticed the movement and turned, offering a hesitant smile. "You're awake," I figured. "You could use some coffee." He placed a steaming mug on the small coffee table. "You passed out pretty much the second you sat down last night. You needed the rest." His tone was factual, not pitying. Wyatt pushed himself up slowly, his body aching. "Thank you," he said, his voice still rough. The rest of the day passed in a quiet, awkward truce. At dinner, a simple meal of canned soup and toast. Wyatt insisted on sitting at the tiny kitchen table, separate from where Edward usually ate on the couch. He ate slowly, politely, careful not to seem too hungry. When Edward wasn't looking, he watched the young man sketch in a notebook, his brow furrowed in concentration. He kept his eyes down whenever Edward glanced his way. Later, as he helped clear the 2 bowls, the loose sleeve of Wyatt's worn flannel shirt slipped down his forearm. Edward's eyes caught sight of it, a long, jagged scar that ran from his wrist to his elbow. Pale and old, but impossible to miss. He said nothing, but the image etched itself into his mind. That night long, after the apartment had gone quiet, Edward lay awake. He heard a soft sound from the living room, a muffled groan of pain. He slipped out of bed and walked barefoot to the couch. Wyatt was curled into himself, eyes shut tight, his face pale. He whimpered again, a sound so quiet it was almost swallowed by the city's hum. Edward hesitated, then went to the kitchen and returned with a glass of water and 2 aspirin. He gently touched Wyatt's shoulder. Wyatt's eyes shot open, a flicker of fear in them before he recognized Edward. "It's just the cold," he mumbled, trying to wave him off. "Gets in my bones here," Edward said softly, holding out the pills and water. "It might help." Wyatt took them without another word, his large calloused hand brushing against Edward's. The contact was brief, but it sent a strange warmth through Edward's chest. He stood there for a long time, watching the older man settle back into a restless sleep. He didn't know his story, but he knew pain. When he saw it, he'd seen that same haunted look in the mirror more times than he could count. Before going back to his room, Edward scribbled a quick note on a piece of paper and left it on the coffee table beside Wyatt's empty mug. The next morning, Wyatt woke to weak sunlight filtering through the blinds. His aches had lessened. He blinked as he noticed the folded note beside him. He opened it. "You're not invisible." The handwriting read, "Not anymore." His lips trembled. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, someone had seen him, really seen him. A few days later, the apartment smelled of chili and cornbread. Wyatt moved quietly through the kitchen, his sleeves rolled up. He had insisted on helping. "Just let me contribute," he'd said, his voice gruff but firm. "I'm not a man who takes handouts." Edward hadn't argued. Now Wyatt stood at the stove, stirring a pot with a practiced hand. The kitchen looked different with him in it, more grounded, more like a home. Edward walked in, a laptop under his arm. "That smells amazing." Wyatt glanced back with the faintest hint of a smile. "Just something simple. Learn to make it stretch." During long winters on the ranch, the word ranch hung in the air. The first Real piece of his past he'd offered. He took a spoonful, blew on it, and offered it to Edward. See what you think. Edward tasted it. It was rich and smoky with a warmth that had nothing to do with spice. He looked up at Wyatt, who seemed calm, unaware of the small revelation. But something pulled at Edward, not mistrust, more like a desperate need to understand the man who now occupied his space. That night, after Wyatt had gone to sleep on the couch, Edward searched. It didn't take long. A few key words. Wyatt's last name, which he'd learned from a piece of mail in his satchel. Ranch foreclosure. The headline was from a regional paper. Historic Miller Ranch lost a bank after decades of family ownership. There was a photo, Wyatt, younger, standing proudly beside a weathered barn, his arm around a woman. The article detailed a string of bad luck: drought, falling cattle prices, mountain of debt left by his late father. His wife, it mentioned, had left him shortly before the final foreclosure. He had lost everything. Next day, Edward found him staring out the window at the snow-covered street. "I saw the article," Edward said quietly. Wyatt didn't turn, just nodded slowly. "Figured you'd look me up. You seem like someone who doesn't like loose ends." Edward Flynn's head. He was right. "It's all true," Wyatt said, his voice flat. "I lost the land my great-grandfather built. I lost my wife. I lost myself. After a while, people didn't want the truth. They just wanted someone to blame." He finally turned to look at Edward, his blue eyes searching. "So tell me, does that change things?" Edward opened his mouth but hesitated, unsure of what to say. Pity, he felt, was tangled up with a confusing mix of respect and something deeper he couldn't name. That flicker of hesitation was all Wyatt needed to see. "Thanks," he said softly, a humorless smile touching his lips, "for your honesty." He walked back to the living room and began to gather his things. When Edward saw him at the door, his coat on and satchel in hand, his eyes widened. "You're leaving?" Wyatt knelt to tie his boots. "I have to, kid. I'm no good for you. You need a father, not a failure." "You're not a failure." Edward's voice broke. "You're just lost. We both are. That's why this works." Wyatt stood up, his tall frame filling the doorway. He reached out and placed a hand on Edward's shoulder, a gesture that was both comforting and final. "You're a good kid, Edward. Don't let a broken-down cowboy drag you under." He didn't say goodbye. He just opened the door and disappeared into the evening. That night, Edward couldn't work. He couldn't sleep. The apartment felt colder and emptier than it had in years. He stood by the window, staring down at the spot in the park where he'd first seen Wyatt. "He was my family," Edward whispered to the empty room, his voice catching in his throat. He didn't know what had shattered more that night, his hope or the silence he'd grown so used to, driven by a feeling he couldn't explain. Edward pulled on his jacket and shoes and headed out into the cold. He found the hallway empty and the front door of the building slightly ajar. He stepped onto the stoop and saw a lone figure through the falling snow. It was Wyatt, sitting on the steps of the building next door, his head in his hands, his hat on the concrete beside him. He hadn't gone far. Edward's heart twisted. He started down the steps, but his foot slipped on a patch of ice. He cried out as he fell, his hands scraping hard against the rough concrete. Blood welled from his palm, staining the snow a soft red. Wyatt's head shot up at the sound. He was there in an instant, kneeling beside Edward without hesitation. "Hold still," he murmured, pulling a clean handkerchief from his coat pocket, and wrapping it firmly around the wound. "You got to be more careful," he pressed. The cloth gently, his touch surprisingly tender as he soothed Edward's hiss. Breaths of pain, the street lamp hailed his tired face, and all Edward saw was a stranger turned caregiver, a protector. Edward looked up at him with wide, frightened eyes, though not from the fall. "I went looking for you," he sniffled, tears of pain and frustration mixing. Wyatt looked down at their hands, his large scarred one holding Edward's smaller, bleeding one, the armor he'd worn for years of professional distance and emotional caution, cracked. He hadn't felt needed like this, not in a long, long time. "Thank you, Edward," said softly, the warmth in Wyatt's voice, the gentleness of his touch was a kind of nurturing Edward had thought was lost to him forever. He met Wyatt's eyes, the snow drifted behind him like quiet confetti. Edward began, his voice thick with emotion. "We need you." The words felt fragile in the cold air, but they were true. "Don't leave again," he whispered. Wyatt's breath caught. He stared at the young man whose belief had somehow cracked open his callous heart. All at once everything changed, not because of explanations, but because in that moment one person was holding another, making an imperfect, painful moment feel sacred. Without another word, Wyatt helped Edward to his feet and pulled them both back inside, shutting the door on the snow and the street lamp. Inside, Edward rested his head against Wyatt's shoulder, a wave of relief washing over him. Wyatt held him close, warm despite the cold retreating outside. In that unspoken moment, Wyatt let go of his fear because the thought of letting Edward go again felt unbearable. For the first time, he believed some doors deserved to stay open. The offer came casually. "You're good at organizing things," Wyatt said one evening, gesturing to Edward's meticulously arranged bookshelves. "Maybe you could help me put together a resume. Find some work." Edward blinked, taken aback. "Are you sure?" Wyatt nodded, his gaze steady. "A man needs a purpose, so." Wyatt stayed, not as a guest this time, but not fully a part of the home either. He was a warm, quiet presence, a soft rumble of a voice during late night talks, hands callous from a lifetime of labor, now learning to navigate job application websites. The days passed gently. Wyatt found a job doing security at a downtown office building, the night shift which suited his solitary nature. One Saturday afternoon, Edward was sketching at the kitchen table while Wyatt read the paper. "We need more coffee, Dad," Edward chirped without thinking, his mind on his drawing. He froze, the word hanging in the air. Wyatt glanced up from his paper, his expression unreadable. He said nothing, but a slow, faint smile touched his lips before he returned to the page. Later, after a quiet dinner, the house took on a peaceful rhythm. Wyatt sat on the couch, cleaning his old leather boots, the scent of polish filling the small room. "You've made this place feel bigger," Edward said quietly, taking the seat across from him. Wyatt looked up, his work forgotten. "It's your home. I'm just passing through." "No," Edward said, his voice lower, closer. "It's more than that." He leaned forward, and in the soft dimness their eyes locked. For a fleeting second, the world was silent enough to believe in second chances, but just before Edward could close the distance between them, Wyatt pulled back. "I can't," he whispered. Froze. "I know," he said, his voice tightening. "I'm not asking you to be my father. You're not," Wyatt whispered, standing up. "Then why does it feel like I'm a broken old man trying to find shelter with a kid who deserves the world. Edward stood to the space between them charged because you won't let yourself be seen, he said, his voice rising with frustration. You think I want a replacement dad, but I want you. Your scars, your silence, your strength. I don't want a fantasy, I want real. Wyatt was trembling. You say that, he said softly, but I've been left before. It cost me everything, so you'd rather leave first? Edward asked the question, laced with bitterness, before you even let anyone choose you. Wyatt didn't answer. His eyes shimmered, not with anger but with a sorrow so deep it stole Edward's breath. And then, without another word, he turned and walked out the door. Edward didn't stop him. His fists curled tight as the door clicked shut. He hadn't meant to fall for him, but he had, and Wyatt hadn't meant to run, but he did, because love, when you've been burned by it, feels more like fire than warmth. The apartment was quiet again. The silence was heavier, this time filled with the ghost of laughter and the scent of chili. It had been 3 days when Edward went to straighten the blankets on the couch where Wyatt had slept. He saw it, an envelope tucked into the cushions. His name was written on it in a surprisingly neat hand. He opened it with trembling fingers. Effing, you're the first person in a long time to make me feel like I had a home, but before I can be someone's partner, I have to learn how to believe I deserve to be. There are pieces of me I'm still stitching back together, parts of my soul that forgot what safety felt like. I want to be the kind of man you can stand beside, not just for a warm meal or a roof over my head, but for staying, for being strong, for choosing love over fear. So for now, I have to go, not because I don't care for you, but because I do. You gave me something no one else ever has, the space to be real, and I hope one day I'll be brave enough to walk back through that door, not as someone passing through, but as someone who finally knows where he belongs. Yours, Wyatt. Edward didn't realize how tightly he'd gripped the paper until the edges crumpled. Wyatt had left, but not to run away. This time he had left to learn how to come back. Still, the ache was sharp. That night, Edward sat in the quiet of the living room, holding the letter. For the first time in years, he let himself cry, not just from sadness, but from hope, because this didn't feel like goodbye. It felt like a promise. Community Center was aglow in soft gold light, strings of fairy lights woven around the room for the annual Christmas Eve open mic night. At the side of the small stage, Edward stood, his heart pounding. After a year of rebuilding his confidence and his courage, he was here, about to read a piece he'd written, but even surrounded by the warm support crowd, something was missing. And now, the host said with a smile, we have a reading from Edward Archer. Edward walked onto the stage holding a crumpled piece of paper, his voice, though small at first, carried with steady clarity. My name is Edward, he said. I used to think family was something you were born with. And when mine decided they didn't want me, I thought I'd lost my chance at a home. He paused, his eyes scanning the crowd. Then one day I met someone. He had cold hands but a warm heart. He was a cowboy who'd lost his ranch, and I was a city kid who'd lost his way. A hush fell over the room. He didn't stay long. Edward continued, his voice trembling now. But he taught me that home isn't the walls around you. Home is where someone sees you, truly sees you, and decides to stay. And even if they have to leave for a while, you wait for them. he unfolded. His paper, this is for him, the applause was gentle, reverent. Edward was frozen. He barely felt the crowd watching him as he stepped off the stage, and then he saw him, Wyatt, emerging from the back of the room. He wore a clean, dark shirt and jeans, and his dark brown cowboy hat was held respectfully in his hands. He looked different, the deep exhaustion in his eyes had been replaced by a quiet strength. He stopped in front of Edward. I heard there was a writer here I needed to see, he said, his voice low. That was a hell of a story. Edward stared at him, speechless. I thought I left too much damage behind to ever deserve future, Wyatt whispered, and I thought keeping people away would protect what little I had left, Edward replied, but it turns out letting you in gave me everything. Wyatt's lip trembled. I kept something, he said softly. Reaching into his jacket pocket, he pulled out a folded piece of paper, creased and worn at the edges. Edward recognized it instantly, the note he had left on the coffee table that first morning. You're not invisible. You were the first person to see me again, Wyatt said, his voice thick with emotion. Not the failure, not the homeless man, just me. He stepped closer. I want to see all of you without fear, without running. Edward's voice cracked as he whispered, then I think I'd like you to come home. Wyatt's smile finally reached his eyes. I am home. He reached out and gently took Edward's hand, his callous fingers lacing through Edward's. The crowd erupted into warm applause, not for poetry or performance, but for something rarer, a family found and chosen. The morning light spilled softly through the apartment window. Wyatt leaned against the door frame, mug of coffee in his hand. You know, he murmured, this is the first morning in years I didn't wake up feeling like something was missing. Edward glanced up at him, his smile soft and unguarded. On the table between them lay a small, framed photo of the two of them taken at the community center the night before. Beneath it, Edward had placed a small, handwritten card. Let's learn to stay in this apartment where everything had once felt too silent, too empty. There was now music again, even if it was only laughter and the clatter of forks against plates. Later that morning, Edward led Wyatt into his small bedroom, which also served as his art studio. Propped against one wall was a large blank canvas. I've been saving this space, Edward said, not knowing why until now. He turned to Wyatt. I want to paint you, not as the man on the bench, but as the man who came home. Wyatt stood in the doorway, his breath caught in his throat. I never imagined anyone would want to build a picture of me, he whispered. You built something in me first, Edward replied. This is just returning the foundation. Pancakes are ready. You two, Wyatt called from the kitchen. They turned to the sound of his voice echoing down the hallway. Edward laughed, the kind of laugh that only comes when the heart has finally settled. I guess that's our cue, he said, reaching for Wyatt's hand. Cowboy took it without hesitation. Together, they walked back into the kitchen where the table was set, a small mountain of pancakes in the middle. As they sat down, Wyatt pulled something from his pocket. It was a small, leather-bound journal, the cover beautifully told with the image of a cityscape meeting a wide open prairie. He pushed it across the table to Edward. For your stories, he said. Edward opened it. On the first page in Wyatt's neat script was a single line. Family is not built by blood, but by the hands that hold you when you're lost. Edward looked between the pages, and the man who had Learned to love again, he smiled not with sadness or hesitation, but with certainty. They had not found perfection, but they had found home, and sometimes that was the far greater miracle. A young man's desperate words, a cowboy's silent grief, and a love that thought it had nothing left to offer. Together they built something no storm could ever take away, a home born not from walls but from the hands that held. Thanks for watching.